Hey everyone, welcome to part 5 on Meditations on the Tarot, a Journey Into Christian Hermeticism. If you're interested in the full series of this, the even numbers are going to be public and freely accessible, and the odd numbers will be for patrons only. So if you're interested in episodes 4 and 2 on those cards respectively, then please find links for the Patreon in the description below. It's $5 a month, will get you access to all of that and much more, and it keeps everything going. But without further ado, welcome everyone to part 5, the Pope, in French, Le Pape, on the original Marseille deck, and let's jump in. The author begins once again with quotes from scripture, beginning with Genesis. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, and blessed be God Most High. Moving into John, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And into Galatians, henceforth let no man trouble me, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. For the author, the card, the Pope, the Pape, puts us in the presence of the act of benediction. When thinking of this card, one should never really lose sight of the idea of benediction, the matter of benediction and everything associated with it. And don't worry if you don't know what benediction really means, because ultimately the author is already saying that he's going to ask a few clear questions. What is benediction? What is its source and its effect? Who has the authority to bestow benediction? And what role does it play in the spiritual life of humanity? And the author makes it clear quite early on, benediction isn't simply a wish for others. It's not simply a thought put onto others. It is for the author the putting into action of divine power by one who is authorized to do so, one who is blessed, and one who is pronouncing the blessing. In other words, for the author, is essentially a sacerdotal act. And of course, with all these ideas of authority, we can immediately see why this relates to the figure of the Pope. Benediction for the author is a double movement, an ascending and a descending, similar to the circulation of blood, similar to the idea of respiration and breathing in our up, down, ascending, descending. We can think of the prayers of humanity rising towards God, being divinely oxidized, transformed into benedictions, and therefore they are sent from the above to the below, coming from the below to the above, and it's an act which is back and forth, a double movement. And of course it pays to think of this symbol of the Pope and the reality of the Pope for people who are Catholic, in relation to this notion of hierarchy we saw in the previous card, the idea of legitimacy and authority, one who can allow this double movement to even happen with a clear legitimacy which is all agreed upon and seen via the apostolic tradition. So let's look at the image of the card, of the Arcanum. We notice before the Pope, and this is quite strange to see, and it's quite difficult to describe for those who are just listening, we have an image of the Pope with, before him, sort of possibly knelt, but maybe standing in just smaller stature, two acolytes, one to his left, with their left hand raised, and one to his right with their right hand lowered. There is behind him two blue columns, which symbolize this twofold current, which I've already mentioned, the ascension and the descension, the rising and the descending of prayers and benedictions. With the Pope holding himself aloft, within his left hand, there is a sort of triple cross, which is a vertical gold with 3 gold horizontals through it at the beginning. And the column on the... I need to get this right. The column with the prayer and the praying acolyte is the one with his right hand lowered, I believe. And the one with the acolyte on his left is the column of benediction, with the acolyte receiving benediction, making the gesture of benediction. So the right hand side and the left hand side of this whole card contain a deeper symbolism, with a pillar of mercy and a pillar of severity, and the right and the left and these two pillars and these two acolytes are corresponding to prayers to prayer and benediction, the prayer of the below, the benediction of the above, and the double movement between prayer coming from the below to the above, which is the ascension, and then the benediction coming back down in answer as the descension. A double movement represented by the two columns and by the two acolytes, a giving and receiving, which is therefore authorized by the Pope, who will notice, and this is very important, and we'll get to this, don't worry, is guarding these two pillars, and there's an importance to that. Equally, one will notice that the card is soaked in the colours of blue and red, with the blue colour for the author is ascending, and the red colour, which is the oxidized sort of arterial colour, descending. The red, or the red blood, therefore symbolises the benediction of oxygen for the author. The oxygen, the oxidizing of the divine from the above. The prayer rises, it's oxidized in the divine, in this redness, and descends, and the blue sort of releases the organism of all its carbonic acid, says the author. But he doesn't expand on this, so don't ask me why he mentions carbonic acid, but this is, for those that know their spiritual stuff, carbonic acid appears in many spiritual people. I won't mention any more on that. These two columns represent a practical significance, which emphatically, this is the very important statement which the author emphasizes time and time again. These two columns in that double movement, he sort of names, and they represent symbolically spiritual respiration. Okay, spiritual respiration in the life of the organism. A prayer that's rising up, it's oxidized divinely, and the benediction is received. It is a matter of respiration between the two. So that is the reality. That is the practical teaching of this card, this fifth card for the author, is spiritual respiration. So once again, we take this idea of respiration that we've learned what it is, and for the author, we have a horizontal respiration, which takes place between the outside and the inside, and we have the vertical respiration, which takes place between the above and the below. We've mentioned this whole idea of horizontal and the vertical before. Anyone who knows the theology, spirituality behind the cross will also understand this very well. So, what does this really matter in this instance? Well, the author asks us to think of death. He says that death is really about the abrupt passage from the horizontal, which is the progressive lifeline of man, minutes, hours, seconds, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age, death. That's the horizontal line we're going from. And the vertical, which is the intense spiritual reality that one is living on. On the lower of the vertical, you're living in those base desires. You might be closer to a mineral or even to an animal, a base desires of just lust and emotions. And as you ascend, you're getting higher on the vertical. And the author very distinctly says is that what death is the abrupt passage from the horizontal, which is the material passage of life, through to the vertical. And so, but he says, if one really learnt the practical lessons of spiritual respiration and learnt vertical respiration and became imbued with that vertical before his death arrives, he will be spared the sting of death. He'd be ready for it spiritually. And so the passage from one form of respiration to the other, horizontal to vertical, isn't a right angle or a sharp turn. If you think about the horizontal and vertical, it's not a sharp turn between them. Don't suddenly just jump from the horizontal to the vertical. For the author states it's an arc, like a arcing up or a bend. It's a gradual increase into this form of vertical respiration. The transition cannot and will not be abrupt. I would add, however, a digression of my own here, that actually one can see why this cannot be and what happens when this can happen, in my own opinion. And this is when people take hallucinogens or psychoactive drugs, right? They suddenly have the intense vertical, which is abrupt, and often this sends people somewhat crazy or whatever, and this is because that passage, which is meant to be gradual and meant, the things right at the top you can't deal with immediately. It's meant to be gradual. It's not an abrupt turn, and to do that puts you in a place that you weren't ready for. And so, to overthrow the gradual and to overthrow the gradual act of being imbued with the vertical is a very dangerous act, basically. Vertical respiration is the alternation between vertical respiration above and below, is the alternation between prayer below and benediction, grace from above. These elements of the vertical respiration are found within all domains of inner life, mind, heart, and will. Thus, for the author, intellectual curiosity, specifically intellectual curiosity, is never really about collecting data. It's rather a thirst for truth, which is itself fundamentally a problem related to prayer. The illumination of this inner curiosity then is only really revealed by, for the author, by the corresponding benediction or grace, with suffering itself acting as this sort of in-between as a form of prayer. So what the author's really saying is that when we're in this active vertical respiration and we're having an intellectual curiosity, which we often think as a horizontal thing, a material thing, he's saying that the only way in which the curiosity is worked out, the intellectual problems are worked out, are really through a prayer and a grace afforded to us in relation to that horizontal, and then the gradual ascent begins there. A further digression on this, as the author does specifically mention suffering as this sort of form, digression would be the work of George Gurdjieff and many other Christian mystics as well, put this emphasis on, and not even Christian mystics, institutional religion, if you want to call it that, or everyday forms where people haven't really delved into the mysticism, the idea of bearing one's cross, right? The idea of taking something which the horizontal, as in a way, is simply that's the life you've been handed. And if one is to simply is to just whine and see the suffering that they've been afforded, and I would emphasize that word, if one is only to see the suffering that they've been afforded as simply, why me? Why did this happen to me? Why did I end up with this, I don't know, horrible illness, or this horrible thing happened to me, this tragedy? And if they whine and they take it in a negative way and take it as a slight against them and take it in a prideful manner, they really do just remain on the horizontal within the world of the material. But as they begin to voluntarily suffer, to take that suffering on, to work with it, to allow it to imbue them in such a sense that their virtues grow, that is when that path of ascension on the vertical really begins internally. And so really the Christian notion of offering up one's suffering is itself that form of learning, that form of prayer, that form of growth. And it's almost like you need a form of friction, you need something to push against to grow from, a form of inner development, a form of inner friction. A sailor never became a good sailor on calm seas, for instance. So following this form of suffering for the author becomes consolation, is peace and joy, and following from this is the effects of benediction. We can really think also about the idea of negative emotions in many spiritual currents. The idea of looking at negative emotions for what they really are, understanding that it's really a choice to have negative emotions, and from that develops a joy in this realization that you can have a different relationship with negative emotions, or what are known as negative emotions. Anyway, moving back to this idea of intellectual work, the author quite strictly says, intellectual work is prayer, creative effort is prayer, material efforts within life are also prayer. All these forms of existence and all these forms of language have their correspondence with benediction. He is saying that really everything that is done within life in relation to this sort of human curiosity is taking part in this spiritual respiration, this prayer, this benediction. And he says we begin to think of the Sermon on the Mount and the form of correspondence, the form of correspondence between prayer and benediction, between the above and the below. And the Beatitudes for the author can be understood as a formula of vertical respiration. They teach it to us. This vertical respiration is the state of the soul. I'd repeat that. The act of vertical respiration, where one's got to with this act of vertical respiration, is the state of the soul, which the Apostle Paul designated as freedom in God. It is a new way of breathing, a form of breath, a form of divine breath, in which one freely breathes or breathes freely. Okay, freedom in God is the important there. And back to Corinthians, the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And so equally, when we think of horizontal respiration, we think of extroversion to introversion. That is, the drawing the attention of one's external material life into his subjective inner life. For instance, when we hear the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, from Luke, this acts as a great example of taking the external world, your neighbor, the ongoings of that material neighbor, and drawing that into your inner subjective world so that you can empathize, so that you can truly love as Christ loved, right? So here we begin to talk about the 3 levels of horizontal respiration and the 3 levels of vertical respiration. So the 3 levels of horizontal respiration are love of nature, love of one's neighbor, and love of the beings of the spiritual hierarchies, etc., angels, etc. And there's 3 stages of vertical respiration: purification by divine breath, which we've spoken about, illumination by divine light, and mystical union in divine fire. And this is why the Pope is holding that triple cross. The vertical line, which the Pope is holding, so to speak, is divided at the top into 3 parts. Therefore, for the author, the cross is the complete and perfect spiritual respiration, the horizontal and the vertical, the 3 levels. It is the cross of loving your neighbor and the triple love of God, faith, light, and hope. And you'll notice in these 3 levels of horizontal respiration, once again where we're drawing the outside in, the first level, the love of nature, loving plants, loving animals. Begin, if you want to learn how to love, don't begin with humans. It's a tricky situation. There's lots of things involved. And certainly don't begin with saints and angels. Of course you can. I'm not telling you what to do, but it's difficult. Thomas Aquinas says this. If you want to learn how to love, begin with animals. I think he might even say begin with plants. Can you take the time out of your day to begin loving a plant? Sounds silly, but I've had Japanese peace lilies here and they've died within weeks. And yet I still believe at the same time that I could love my neighbor. And it's interesting that the 3 levels of horizontal respiration begin with the love of neighbor. And this is, once you've figured that out, once you can love a dog or love a plant, then love one's neighbor. Then you might be able to do that. And then finally, love of the beings of the spiritual hierarchy. So in these the 3 levels of horizontal respiration, which is love, which is happening, drawing the external world into the internal world, there's still a hierarchy there. And then you move into the vertical. And so, really, the author calls this what the Pope is holding. He does call it a scepter, and he says it acts as the symbol, once again, for the Pope's authority. Equally, the Pope acts as a guardian, right, of the portal of the pillars behind him of prayer and benediction as represented on the card. And so when we think back to the previous card of the throne and the emperor, no amount of connectivity could replace the spiritual reality and authority which was bestowed upon the emperor due to his spiritual significance. An overview very, very quickly for those that aren't patrons. The emperor is sat out in the open in a silence. He's away from the collective. And this gives him his authority because he's not intruded by the mimetic, virulent strains of collective bias, right? This gives him his authority. And so equally, the author says, no ecumenical council, no collective can replace the spirituality of the post of the Pope, his position on the throne, because he's been afforded this. So here the author, once again, I repeat this most talks, this is how it happens in the book, but the author suddenly just goes, right, now we're talking about this. Here the author turns to the metaphors of day and night. Okay, with the former day being exoteric, EX, and the latter night being esoteric, ES, internal. The night is silent and obscure, and it is always full of events in preparation. It's the unconscious or even the superconscious. This is where we find the magical side of history, the acts working behind the facade of history, which are often seen by the day. Therefore, we enter into a formula once again of twofold teaching: the speech of the day, which is seen, and the knowledge of the night. A twofold tradition: verbal teaching, direct inspiration, spoken word, silent radiation, visible history of the day, invisible history of the night. And so when we think of both the cards of the Emperor and the Pope, we realize that both their realities are on both sides of the threshold between the day and the night. But we'll focus on the Pope. The Pope is the guardian of this threshold. Okay, we have the day of prayer, of the below, of human prayers from the below, and we have the pillar of night of benediction, which is coming from above, the invisible history. And the Pope is seated between this threshold. He's seated between and before these two pillars as a guardian. Okay, and as the Emperor is the master of the day, the Pope is the guardian of the reality of the relationship between the day and the night. He guards the equilibrium between the two, between the above and the below, between human effort and divine grace. Here the author turns to Moses in Genesis 4:5. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. The separation from the intelligible material below, from the mysterious invisible behind of the night. And this for the author is the analogy of the Spirit of God moving above the face of the waters. Okay, this is the prototype of respiration, of spiritual respiration. This primordial water, we often hear about God, the Spirit of God moving on the waters. This primordial water, penetrated by divine breath, is the essence of blood. Breath reflected by the water is light, and the rhythmic alternation from absorption of the breath by water to its reflection in the respiration. The respiration then between blood and light, between divine breath and divine light. And so we think back to the emperor, even though he is found in the day and he's appointed in the day, he is anointed by the night, okay? He owes his authority to the night. Okay, he's allowed that silence to imbue him, but it's from the night, from that invisible reality, that he is afforded and anointed his position in the day. All that is in the material, all that is in the day, is in the intelligible, is in the seen, is in the speech, is in the word, is in the material, is in the below, is afforded its reality, its knowledge, by the invisible reality of the night, of the above, of divine grace. And this, for the Pope, truth is found in that which comprises harmonious respiration, and falsity is that which upsets this harmony. From the position of modern science, heliocentric systems of astronomy are entirely true, but from the point of view of the Pope and this card, heliocentric, which is the general scientific understanding of where the positions of the planets are now, as we generally understand it, and the Earth not being central, from the point of view of this card of the Pope, this is fundamentally false in relation to spiritual respiration. For that which comes from above, the divine blood issued from Christ, allows us a central position in the space of all values, in the space of the above. So from the position of benediction and prayer, the geocentric cosmos is true. I mean, that's big. From the position of benediction and prayer, the geocentric cosmos is true. And so therefore we shall find two truths, actually, strangely. One is actual and temporal, material, horizontal, and the other is ideal or eternal, vertical. First as a logic of facts, and the other is moral logic, an eternal moral logic. So here we come across the problem of double truth in its entirety. The question of moving between the two truths of the factual, the below, the material, and the moral, the vertical, the above. And the fact that they have to meet at some point with regard revelation in man. And it's here we turn back to that gradual ascent that I mentioned earlier, and that the two meet slowly, given the actual state of affairs, and they still often contradict one another despite this graduality. And once again, you can see that if those two realities are just to slam together in an instant, the contradictions would be so abundant that you can see why one, in an almost Lovecraftian sense, would go mad. So, for the author, this is why St. Paul said the wisdom of this world is folly with God in Corinthians. The Pope is only that which is ideal, which is true for him, that which is eternal and above. This is why for him marriage is indissoluble. This is why there is confession and repentance. This is why there is a church which is guided by the Holy Spirit. The Pope then is found in the middle of a conflict between ideal truth and actual truth, between mercy and truth. For the author, this conflict is called a wound, the wound of the heart. This contradiction between the below and the above, these two truths that we're talking about, this is a wound of the heart. The author here is relating this to the question of the sacred heart, which was caused externally by one of the soldiers who pierced the side of Christ with his spear, out of which came blood and water, equally representing for the author mercy and truth, with water consistently always representing truth. And it is of note that the blood and water were not mixed, as I mentioned. They were two separate entities, allowing us to understand the spiritual sense of the wound is expressed in the symbol. The wound is therefore this conflict between mercy and truth, between the actual fact and the ideal, between the material and the eternal. It is this position, this wound, which the Pope finds himself within. Here the author goes on a long digression about the esotericism of the idea of 5 wounds, which he relates to the idea of a pentagram, which I won't go into too deep as it takes up a lot of time, and ultimately does this whole thing where it draws away and then he comes back to the Pope later. The ultimate question ends up in the difference between basically an evil quintinary pentagram and a good one. Honestly, in relation to the Pope, this is a whole other digression. But I'm not including everything in these talks. I'm really focusing on the main symbols of the card. But without going into the complexities of this, the author's discussion of the pentagram, he states that the immense emancipated human personality is good when it's the expression of the personality whose will is united and bound to the fullness of the manifestation of unity. That is really bound to God. That's when a good personality. And evil when he expresses the will of the personality separated from unity. And we can once again think about spiritual respiration in harmony and out of harmony, and the Pope guarding that truth or falsity. So in relation to this previous mentioned blood and water here, we're thinking here is the fact that these weren't mixed, that they stand alone, that there's a question of choice, that there's a question of contradiction, that there's a question of this wound between them. And once again, we're returning to the idea of personal arbitrary magic and personal, or just generally, sacred magic. There is magic which is separated from the above, and a magic which is bound to the above. The aforementioned, as we know from previous talks, the aforementioned arbitrary magic is simply an operation whose only initiative is found exclusively within the will and understanding of the personality of the operator, him or herself. Thereby, they can only make use of a force which is lower than themselves. They'd only be on the horizontal, okay, because they're not affording to the legitimacy of the vertical, okay. The operator and the senses are really at their own peril with this. This type of magic can easily be designated for the author as Faustian, right, for those who know Goethe. This magic can, in a certain sense, be bolstered. This is really when it becomes Faustian. It can be bolstered by a magic chain, which is whereby the operator is lent forces by a collective. But one can probably already understand that this collective is only existing still within the horizontal level to the degree of one of the personal wills. Whereas we can speak of forces acting through an operator as intermediary from the above, which he obeys. This is as a chain, but it's clear that it's not a vertical chain or a qualitative chain, which would be hierarchical. Okay, so the sacred magic is once again in relation to that above, and the personal arbitrary is all once again on the below and the personal initiative of someone. So we have 3 types of magic here: Faustian, collective, and sacred. With the collective really being the individual one, the Faustian one really affording a chain, but both still on the horizontal, and the below, and the sacred one, which is completely in accordance with the harmony of the above. And so the first 2 are really based on the form that might is right, and the third form of magic is not really a force of the will, but it's a purity, right? As we saw, it's a silence, it's an openness to the above and what you're afforded by the above. It's pure and it's correct, hence why the Emperor and the Pope are both afforded their position. The author here continues his digression on the idea of this wound that we're within. For the author, a wound is a door through which the objective exterior world intrudes into the interior of the closed system of the subjective interior. And it is such a wound which allows the outside to penetrate into the interior. We can think of skin, the idea of breathing inwards into the lungs, the idea of eating. These are all notions where the outside enters into the inside and something is taken inwards from the objective external into the subjective internal and used in some sense. The author even sees the eyes as the organ of sight as a wound, which are covered by a mobile skin, that is to say the eyelids. And one can think of, when the eyelids are closed, one is not taking in something, but when they're open, you're actually making a conscious choice. Are you taking in bad impressions? Are you taking in things that you shouldn't be taking in? Really, the eyes, in that certain sense, completely ingest and digest the world as the same as the stomach or the digestive organs. Okay. Here the author begins to specify about 5 wounds, which is where the card gets a little bit more complex, and he corresponds these to the potential in a counter tradition of these wounds for the potential for, and this sort of once again ties all together at the end, for 5 dark currents of potential personal will: the desire for personal greatness, the desire to take, to keep, to advance, and to hold on to at the expense of others. Okay, so we have these sort of 5 things which might be anathema to these wounds. Okay, so the desire to take or to get hold of things, he says, is bound to the right hand. The desire to retain or to keep belongs to the left hand. The desire to advance at the expense of others and a desire to hold on to at the expense of others is related to the right and the left foot respectively. And the desire for personal greatness doesn't correspond to the head. For the head can, if it wishes, wear the crown of thorns, which is borne in principle by everyone who's capable of objective thought. Okay, so the crown of thorns, that sort of potential for suffering, the potential for objective reason, the potential for being conscious. Okay, and so this is why the author thinks that actually the desire for greatness or the will to greatness is not found in the head, but rather in the heart. It reaches the heart, penetrating from the right hand side. Now think back to that earlier symbolism. The heart thereby takes hold of the head, right? This is why when we think of thinkers and scientists who want to think without a heart in order to be objective, this is entirely an illusion. It's not possible. As no one can think without his or her heart as the activating principle of thought, what one can only do is humble their heart and warm it instead of allowing it to become pretentious, rational, and cold. You see this really once again in the work of Gurdjieff, where he talks about the emotional and the thinking center, and really talking about the fact that often when we think we're doing something intellectual, usually it's our emotions that are driving our decision. Anyway, so the author asks, well, how does one acquire these 5 wounds? And there exists only really one method. So these wounds really act as almost a balancing act, as doors, as he's called them, as openings and doors. It's once again back to that sort of choice, right? So the Pope is guarding a wound, and the wound itself is the act of letting something in. So in the same sense that you have to take, to keep, to advance the will for personal greatness as anathema, you also have the alternative to them, right? And so the acquisition of these wounds is acquiring something which allows things to come in, okay? But how can one acquire these and not allow them to become the darker side of things, that acquisitional state which I've just mentioned? And he says there's one method. There is one single method which we know of, and it is via 3 traditional vows: obedience, poverty, and chastity. So, obedience dulls the will to greatness of the heart. Poverty holds fast all desires of keeping things and holding on to things. And chastity pins down the desires of those that wish to advance at the expense of others. Okay, so I'll go into these. Obedience is the practice of silence in the face of reason and conscience. Obedience is order, it is the state, it is the church, it is universal peace. True obedience is actually the opposite of tyranny and slavery, since this root is love, which issues from faith and confidence and doesn't come up from below, but is legitimized, authorized from above. Obedience is basically the recognition of something higher than oneself, who one recognizes as God, and obeys. Now, one thing, there's a really great book, I can't remember the name, by Yves Congar. I can't remember the name. It's got a very old school 70s brown cover, but it's by Yves Congar, and he goes into depth in one chapter about the word obey. Just as a digression here, for those that think, obey, oh God, get down, and you have to obey all these rules. Yves Congar really highlights that in translation, originally the word obey means simply to hear. Okay, so once again, it's that act of opening oneself up, and you hear this thing, and you go, yeah, I know what I should do. And obey is really making the decision away from your own silly personal will, which always leads you to sin and temptation and bad stuff. Poverty is the practice of inner emptiness. It's the silence of personal desires, silence of personal emotions and imagination, so that the soul can allow itself to be entirely open to receiving from the above the revelation of the word, the life, and the light. And chastity, finally, is the means of putting into practice that which lives at the foundation of the heart, which is to say love. Now, chastity triumphs over sterility and indifference. Chastity doesn't solely concern sex. It bears equally on other domains where one might have the choice between love and other sort of potent intoxications. We can think of fascism, power, the draining of consciousness, the idea of radical revolution, etc. These very potent, you could almost say sort of libidinal, lustful things. Chastity actually triumphs over the sterility which would come from these. So these 3 vows for the author are the sole known method of sacred magic, right? That non-personal form which is afforded and legitimized to us. It's not a matter of possessing these virtues as virtues, but simply a rather of practice. That is to say, sincere efforts aimed at their realization. Never thinking of possessing them or acquiring, because then you're falling back into the anathema form of these 5 wounds. It's truly only the effort that counts. One can clearly see that one could get caught up in the idea of acquiring them, right? I've got my first virtue. I'm all poverty. Now I've just got to be chaste, and now I'm all obedient. Look at me. Look how obedient I am. And John Michael Greer talks about this. He says it's a tightrope walk between Luciferic and Abrahamic traits, right? To truly, sincerely, internally not be prideful is an Abrahamic trait. But to be prideful about the fact you are not prideful, which many people fall into, oh, look at how humble I am, you fall back into the Luciferic stuff. Okay, so ultimately it's purity, which allows these five wounds to develop within us. Here, the author, nearing the end, turns to another digression concerning the meanings of limbo, purgatory, and paradise in relation to all that we've talked about. And he understands these as stages or states in the work of transmutation of sacred magic. And he understands these as states in the human body, in body, soul, and spirit, which is really how most... Hell isn't a place, right? These aren't places. These are states, ontological states of being. Okay, when we say someone is in hell, quite literally, like, you could almost say hell is within them, right? They are hell. The author says that each of us has had the experience of a harmonious state of good health, accompanied by carefree state of soul, calmness of spirit. We've all had this state. This is what nature offers us, not as granted. Okay, insofar as we are verging and fallen, right, we can't really enjoy it, right? But when there are no fallen elements in nature, when there's no sickness in sin, no sorrow, no fear and remorse, and if life wasn't a field in which death reaps unceasingly, then we would have this harmonious state of good health, right? But we don't. We fill up our machines with a load of gunk and crap and temptation and sin. So this being the case, therefore, there are time to time, there are moments and hours, perhaps even days, where many of us may have experienced this natural joy without sorrow, right? And it's this experience which allows us the key to the analogy for understanding the first time here, limbo. Limbo is the natural state of physical and psychic health, which is afforded us without the assistance of supernatural or of divine grace. Okay, it's not amazing, it's an in-between. But then when we move to purgatory, it's clear that it's an idea of purging, or the purging of suffering. The purging of is the corporeal, moral, and intellectual suffering, which are the intermediate state between the experience of the innocence of limbo and the moments of heavenly joy within the paradise within each of us, right? So it's this place where we have to purge a lot of stuff to get there. It's not nice, actually. When we think of, in the traditional Catholic tradition, the fires of hell are a spiritual fire which burn up all the problems within us. And the ones in hell, of course, the reason it's such an agonizing thing is because hell is a choice that people make the choice. The door from hell is closed from the inside, as C.S. Lewis says. And so they can't really even understand what this fire is because they've turned from God. And that's the primary reason really that they're there, is they've consciously turned away from God. Okay? And so the fire that's in hell will burn forever, but it's really their choice. Whereas purgatory, it's the same fire, it's the same spiritual fire, burning up the impurities, but eventually you'll get there. So it's not as bad. So our lives really consist, for the author, in these states of reality of limbo, purgatory, and paradise. And it's the aforementioned wounds which lead us out of the state of limbo and purgatory and conduct us towards paradise, right? Making heaven present in limbo and purgatory. It introduces the supernatural into the natural, right? We're talking of miracles really here. So we return to the post of the Pope in his place in the spiritual history of mankind as the guardian of these 5 wounds. That is to say, he guards the legitimate way of passing through. Okay, he's guarding against those who might be trying to get in via the anathema forms of these wounds. And so the mission of the Pope is to take care that spiritual obedience, poverty, and chastity, when they're free or holy, do not disappear from the world, and that there are always those within the world who will embrace them and represent them. These practical values constitute the preliminary conditions for living faith. Right? These 5 wounds are truly the keys to the kingdom of heaven, not in their anathema form. In their anathema form, they are the 5 gates of hell, which I mentioned earlier. That is to say, the will to greatness, the desire to take and to keep, the desire to advance and to hold at the expense of others, and that is the 5. Sorry. And when we think of these 5, will to greatness, desire to keep, to take, the desire to advance, and then hold on to at the expense of others, these are the 5 wounds that are actually the gates to hell. We can see why, right? These are all absolutely prideful, desirous, very human and prideful, etc. And it's in their anathema forms in relation to those obedience, poverty, and chastity that you can begin to see the true path and what it is the Pope is guarding and how one might wish to react against these wounds. And the wound is, of course, then is related back to that twofold process of the spiritual respiration. Okay, which way are you going? So, here at the end, in full, the author says this. The divine magical power of these keys is such that whatever is bound by their virtue on earth will be bound in heaven, and that whatever is loosened by their virtue on earth will be loosened in heaven. For that which is above is that which is below, and that which is below is that which is above. And when disobedience, greed, and unchastity prevail on the earth of such a kind that there never was before, then it is the virtue of the keys of the sacred wounds which can re-establish the unity of that which is above and that which is below, i.e. to bind and to loosen, by an act which, put into words, would have the tenor of the following. May that which is above be as that which is below, and may that which is above... I'll repeat those final two sentences. May that which is above be as that which is below, and may that which is below be as that which is above. So I hope you've all got something from this, and I hope it all roughly makes sense. For those that are interested in the text, there is a current in the text that I'm not fully engaging in because I think it adds in needless complexities, especially for these talks. It would confuse things. There is a Kabbalah text for those that are interested in that within the text. I don't want to, just completely by rote read off the text. So there is way more in there, really. I'm dealing with this primary symbolism relating to that Hermetic tradition of the above and the below in relation to really what the author's talking about in a Christian Hermetic Catholic sense. So yes, obviously this is a public and a free one, so thank you everyone for watching. Thanks once again to all patrons and subscribers who do make it so that I can keep doing all this stuff. Thank you very, very much. And for those that are interested in exclusive content, inclusive of the other two patron-only episodes of this series, the Patreon links will be in the description below, and it's just $5 a month, and it does keep the podcast going as well. It's the only thing. I never want to put ads on there, so please think about doing it if you've enjoyed this content. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all in the next talk.